Welcome everyone to this webinar being organized by MyLaw. This is on institution of suits, various procedural aspects. Our task here today is to learn how to file a civil suit in a civil court in India. So the major takeaways that you will get from this webinar are very basic, simple rules that pertain to the actual institution of a suit. As you're well aware that any provision of law is likely to have exceptions as well. Our task today is not to focus on the exceptions. We'll be focusing on the principal rule so that you know how to actually initiate things. And so to that end, I have divided this webinar into various sections, as you can see from this particular slide. I will first define a suit for you, then look into notice requirements, then requirements of a valid claim, and concomitant to that is that if the requirements aren't met, then what are the grounds on which a plaint can be rejected? And then there are 4 material considerations in any plaint that are necessary and that inevitably lead to the rise of issues. And so I have clubbed them all together in other material considerations, and we'll take a look at them. The reason why I've kept them separate and I'm not naming them out is that you don't actually need these to start your suit off, to actually institute your suit. Whereas what is necessary in the first 3 parts, in the first 4 questions, you will realize is necessary to even institute a suit. So we come first to what is a suit. Quite conveniently, it is something that is not defined in the Civil Procedure Code. But we do know from the phraseology used in the CPC that the party that initiates the proceeding is called a plaintiff, and the opposing party from whom relief is claimed or who has committed the injury is called a defendant. Now, a simple definition given by Chambers Dictionary, which actually will have quite a bit to unpack, but it's a useful starting point, is that a civil suit is a generic term of common signification referring to any proceeding by one person or persons against another or others in a court of law, wherein the plaintiff pursues the remedy which the law affords him for the redress of any injury or enforcement of a right, whether at law or in equity. And it's interesting that this definition actually goes from the remedy to the right, where it says the plaintiff pursues the remedy which the law affords him for the redress of any injury or enforcement of a right. Whereas in actual life, the injury or the need for the enforcement of a right will come first. So basically, if you have suffered any injury at the hands of an individual, you have the right to file a civil suit. And the remedy that you exercise to have that injury redressed or for the right to be enforced is known as a civil suit. And the source of that right or remedy can be in law or in equity. When we say law, that could be common law or statutory law or in equity. The important thing to remember here is the last point in this slide, which is that the right to sue is an inherent right. It need not be conferred by statute, but is often conferred by statute. Why do I say that? Because prior to the surfeit of parliamentary legislation that we treat for granted now, the legal system in the UK and what we used to follow here was known as the common law. And the common law was really a set of rules devised by judges based on the practical outcomes to various problems that they faced. So what they determined at that time was that in tort only means any kind of civil wrong. In the situation of a tort where you have been wronged, you have the right to sue, regardless of the nature of the injury. As long as you have suffered an injury, or if you have a right that has been impaired, you have a right to sue, and you have the right to measure that injury or that impairment of right in terms of damages and to obtain money benefit for it. And that is what is meant by the statement, the right to sue is an inherent right. You have the right to sue merely because you suffer an injury, no statute, no court, no parliamentary requirement to actually enable you to fight a suit. In fact, when you get legislation from Parliament in relation to suits, to management of their filing, they are generally statutes that restrict the filing of a suit in certain specific circumstances. And they do so because Parliament requires finality in certain cases. So there are certain tenancy laws, for example, where you have clear rules that say that there is no right to sue. But even there, judicial remedies are not entirely removed because you have the right to file a writ petition. Now, the second part of the statement is need not be confirmed by statute, but often is conferred by statute, which basically means that there are statutes nowadays that confer causes of action for specific things. So one prime example of this is the Specific Relief Act. The Specific Relief Act is actually a compilation of rules that were developed in the law of equity along with the common law initially. And they were never codified in the way in the Specific Relief Act today. But however, today you have a Specific Relief Act, and therefore it will exclude other common law causes of action that pertain to specific relief, unless, of course, they are not mentioned in the statute at all. So you can have causes of action conferred by statute because Parliament passes statute, and you can sue on that cause of action. So on specific relief, I have the right to sue under Section 5 or Section 6 to say that you entered into a contract with me, you have not performed that contract, whereas I have performed my end of the contract. Therefore, I am suing you to obtain performance from you. That is a suit that is filed under that act. If the act did not exist, the suit could still be filed because you have still suffered an injury, you have still suffered the impairment of a right. One of the questions that often arises is that, is a legal notice necessary prior to the filing of a suit? The short answer is that when a private individual is suing another private individual, a civil suit is not a mandatory requirement. That is, you need not file a notice is not a mandatory requirement. That is, you need not file a legal notice prior to instituting the suit. The institution of the suit can be a very first step, and the way the opposing party discovers it is that notice is issued on your suit, and then that is served upon them through process of the court. That it does not in any way cause major prejudice to the other party, for the simple reason that they have from that time a statutory period of 30 to 90 days to file a written statement, which is sufficient time. So they can, and if they wish to in that time, they can also approach you for a settlement. So there is no requirement of a notice prior to the institution of a suit, because at the instant at which you institute a suit and the notice will be issued by the court and the opposing party will receive the suit. But there are certain exceptions to this. There are certain legislation where notice is absolutely mandatory. I will first take one example from private law where notice is mandatory, although that leads to a quasi-criminal setup. That is Section 138 of the Negotiable Instruments Act, where a check has bounced and you wish to recover under that check, and you wish to initiate criminal proceedings under Section 138. Prior to the institution of a criminal complaint, 138 lays out a requirement that you must first issue notice and give a 30-day period to the opposing party to make the payment under the check. If that payment stands made, no criminal proceedings can be instituted whatsoever. So that is one example of where the issuance of a notice is a mandatory requirement of law. The other broader example is under Section 80 of the Civil Procedure Code, where a notice is mandatory under Section 80 subclause 1 to anybody who is seeking to sue either the government or a public officer with regards to acts done by such an officer in his official capacity. And you can only institute your suit 2 months after the notice has been received by the opposite side. So just to repeat, where you are suing the state or you are suing a public officer who acted in his capacity of office, then you must first issue a 60-day notice prior to the institution of a suit. Now, prior to the amendment in 1976, Section 80 was a mandatory requirement and there were no exceptions possible to it whatsoever. So if you instituted a suit against the government without having met the conditions of Section 80, your plaint was liable to be returned to you, and you would first have to comply with the requirements of Section 80 prior to instituting the suit. What is the rationale behind Section 80? The logic behind it was that if you are that you do not want governments bogged down in too much litigation, which is of course quite amusing now, and The 60-day notice period allows for government to consider avenues by which the matter can be settled in advance. This is prior to the institution of a suit. The experience in general has been that that has failed completely because states rarely, if ever, settle matters prior to the institution of suits or prior to any court orders. And being cognizant of that fact, Parliament eventually amended Section 80 to insert Section 80 subclause 2 and subclause 3. We'll leave subclause 3 aside for a moment. It's not particularly necessary to this debate. But subclause 2 allows you to issue a notice to move an application before a court prior to the institutional suit. This is very important. The suit cannot be instituted first. The application under Section 80 subclause 2 must come first, based on which the court is free to grant leave to you to sue the government without notice. Now, that means when you file an application under 80 subclause 2, you have an application that says, I wish to file a suit, and along with that application, you have also filed your plaint and the documents. The court takes a view that you are permitted because of very specific grounds. The specific ground under 80 subclause 2 is that there is a certain urgency which would be defeated by the issuance of notice and by the expiration of the mandatory 60-day period under 80 subclause 1. So that needs to be done away with. If the court is prima facie of the view that this needs to be done, then it will issue notice. The government will appear. No interim or final order can be granted without hearing the government. So even interim relief under that can only be granted after hearing the government. So let's say on day 1, you have instituted an application under 80 subclause 2, along with your plaint. Court is prima facie on that day of the view that you can, that you should be allowed the benefit of 80 subclause 2. Then the next date of hearing, which is say 3 days later, government appears. On the day on which the government appears, an interim order in your favor can be passed by a court, not on the first day when the government is in court. So that is the import of Section 80 and Section 80 subclause 2. In sum and substance notice requirements, private party to private party notice not required, except required specifically by statute. An example of that is Section 138. When you're suing the government, notice is mandatory, except if you can show grounds under Section 80 subclause 2 that the issuance of notice would defeat the purposes of the suit, in which case the court may grant leave, permit you the institutional suit, and only pass interim orders when the government has responded to the notice. Now, this is sort of the crux of what we require, the requirements of a valid plaint. Along with this, let me also point out Order 4 Rule 1 provides that a suit commences upon the presentment of a plaint to a court of competent jurisdiction. So, and this plaint has to be presented as per the CPC in duplicate. However, different courts have different rules. You must always be wary that CPC is the general law. The special law or the specific law is the specific rules issued by that particular court, or practice directions issued by the relevant High Court. And the Delhi High Court in particular is very active in issuing practice directions. And so you must be mindful of those and not merely read the CPC and arrive at your conclusion. Now, Order 7 Rule 1 lists out the particulars that are to be contained in a plaint. If these particulars are missing, your plaint is liable to be returned, to be refiled upon the fulfillment of these particulars. Some of these particulars, in case they are absent, your plaint is also liable to be dismissed, and any future institution of suit would be subject then to res judicata. So while these are fairly perfunctory requirements in the course of an act of drafting, but if you omit them, there are severe consequences. So it's important to pay notice to these. So for those of you who have ever seen a suit, or if you go online and you see it, what you will find is that the opening page will have on the top of the page, there will be a title, which is the name of the court. There will then be a blank left for the case number, which is a number that is to be filled by the registry. So you will say civil suit number dash of 2020. That dash will be filled in by the registry because that's the numbering that they give as per their own notation. And then you will have the name of the plaintiff and the name of the respondent. And one of the documents that you are required to file at the time at which you institute a suit is what is called as a memorandum of parties. The memorandum of parties lays out in full detail the name and address and other description of the plaintiff and of the defendant. And these addresses which you give in the notice of motion then become the basis of issuance of notice in the future by the court for any purpose, whether it is for a future application or for anything else. So if you've got the address wrong, you may not be able to serve them effectively, in which case you will waste a lot of time going through the CPC's various steps before you come to constructive service and you can proceed with your suit in default. So in order to avoid that kind of delay, it's best to be aware of where you have been dealing with the defendant and where they reside, and to have that correctly stated in your plaint at the outset. So the first thing, as I said, was the name of the court in which the suit is brought. Like I said, that is at the title of the page. The name, description, and place of residence of the plaintiff. In the memorandum of parties, the plaintiff comes first. You will give the name, son of, age, so and so, and then the son of or wife of, which is quite sexist, but this is how it is. And then you give a give the address. And then similarly for the defendant, and be mindful that these addresses are going to be used for future notices. Now, come to clause D here, where the plaintiff or the defendant is a minor or a person of unsound mind, a statement to that effect. Now, you're well aware that being a minor or being a person of unsound mind has certain specific legal consequences. So a court is required to be given prior notice in the event that the person who is either being sued or is suing is either a minor or a person of unsound mind, because the rules that pertain to liability, etc., alter somewhat. For example, in the case of a minor, if a minor is suing to enforce a contractual right or a contractual right under a contract which he has signed or she has signed, then they may require a guardian. More importantly, the relief may have to be deferred till the age of 18. They may also choose to void the contract because they are a minor. When I say choose to void a contract, it means that a minor enters into what are known as voidable contracts. At their instance, they can go to court and say, we wish to void this contract. So that is why this kind of information becomes important and is an important indicator to the court of the nature of analysis that is necessary. At E, we come to the facts constituting the cause of action and when it arose. Now, imperative to this is an understanding of what is the meaning of the word cause of action. Cause of action is very simply defined as all of the facts that are necessary for you to establish the basis of your relief. All the facts that are necessary to establish that you have actually been injured, who caused that injury, and what would be the proper compensation as per you of that injury. Once again, a cause of action is actually, in very simple terms, why you have filed a suit in first. If you look at his cause of action, in simple English, it only means something which gives you a cause to act upon. So what you're acting upon is an injury that you have suffered, and the way you act upon it is you file a suit, and what you seek in relation to that is whatever redress that you like. And you will have to be very specific of the various dates on which it arose, because the period of limitation will be determined from the date on which you say a cause of action arose. Now, in a particular case, a cause of action may arise at different times. The last of these dates, that is the last occasion on which the cause of action arises, will be the date used to determine the running of the limitation period. So please be clear that you need to be aware of all the facts that are necessary that you need to prove to win your case, but you also need to make a statement of the dates on which these particular facts occur, because that will be the basis of determining limitation for you. Now, F says the facts showing that the court has jurisdiction. Now, jurisdiction is a fairly easy idea for most lawyers, or intuitive idea for most lawyers. But jurisdiction actually has three forms. Now, there is territorial jurisdiction, there is pecuniary jurisdiction, and then there is subject jurisdiction. Territorial jurisdiction, I think, is simple enough. In our courts, each court is given a particular territory, and only cases that originate within that territory can be heard by that court. In the case of a district court, it may be a small, specific district. In the case of the high court, it is the entire state. A high court, for example, cannot hear a civil suit by two persons who reside in a completely different state where the cause of action also arises outside of that state. But it can hear a case where the cause of action arises within its state, even though the parties may be resident outside of that particular state. So that is territorial jurisdiction, which is a limitation of territory upon a particular court. Pecuniary jurisdiction is determined based on the monetary value of the claim made. There are laws that say that certain judges only ought to be allowed to hear matters where the claim is rupees X or Y. So for example, in Delhi, any case where the overall claim is less than rupees 2 crores, or if the claim is convertible to money, then is less than rupees 2 crores, that is a suit that you will have to institute in the trial courts, which are located all over the city. So for example, Saket, Tis Hazari, Patiala House, Karkarduma, Dwarka, Rohini, etc. If you're under 2 crores, you institute in these courts. You could have exactly the same cause of action, exactly the same set of facts, exactly the same complexity. But if the value that you claim in your plaint is eventually more than 2 crores, then your suit has to be instituted in the High Court. Right? Please don't confuse pecuniary jurisdiction with complexity of a case. It is purely a question of money. The third head of jurisdiction is called subject matter jurisdiction. And subject matter jurisdiction pertains to, as it says, the core legal issue that that particular court is dealing with. So there are, in our system today, subject matter jurisdiction is of vital importance, because you have a number of specialized tribunals that have been set up to hear matters that pertain to very specific subject matters. So for example, in relation to a suit you wish to file against a company on a matter that arises from the Companies Act. So for example, a minority shareholder wishes to sue for oppression and mismanagement. Earlier, that suit would be instituted in a civil court, but now with the institution of first the Company Law Board and now the NCLT, the suit must be instituted in the NCLT. If you institute it in a civil court, the civil court will simply return your plaint and ask you to file it in the appropriate forum. So subject matter jurisdiction is something that you must evaluate prior to instituting a suit, because it will determine for you which is your correct forum. G is the relief which the plaintiff claims. The biggest problem that you have with the relief is an issue of vagueness. When you set out your prayers, you must be very specific, very precise about what you want. You don't need to cover every single consequence of an outcome in your prayer. You can say, I am entitled to damages of X and other consequential damages as the court may deem fit, for example. And that would be a perfectly valid prayer, not suffering from vagueness. But if you simply say, I am entitled to have my losses repaired, that may suffer from vagueness whatsoever. So on the issue of relief, just be clear about what you want, and that's quite simply that. Now, the concept of a set-off and a relinquishment or a counterclaim is a very particularized concept that you will find in the CPC, where if a plaintiff files a particular case against a defendant, say on a breach of contract, where they say the defendant is supposed to pay me 100 rupees, but they have not done so for supply of certain goods, which I have already undertaken. So therefore, I am suing them for 100 rupees. However, just prior to the institution of the suit, the defendant has paid 20 rupees, or just after the institution of the suit, the defendant has paid 20 rupees. And you can then amend the plaint to say, instead of 100, I am now asking for 80. So I'm setting off 20 rupees. claiming 100, comes back in reply and says, I've already paid 20 and I am not liable to pay the remainder 80. At least that 20 will be set off from your particular claim. And so therefore, setting off is simply a case of subtracting that which has already been provided for. Sorry, just a slight issue with my internet connection. So I just want to check that. Yeah, I think we're fine. Right. A counterclaim is where on the same cause of action, a defendant is asking you for his money back, because he says, in fact, the facts that you have asserted are wrong, and that it is you who owes him or her money, and that they are going to, and that they are therefore asking for it back. We leave that part aside for now. And the last one is a statement of value of the subject matter of the suit for the purposes of jurisdiction and of court fees so far as the case admits. Now, three concepts in this: value of the subject matter, purposes of jurisdiction number 2, and number 3, purposes of court fees. Let's keep them separate. First and foremost is value of the subject matter. Quite simply, value of the subject matter is the extent of your claim, the value of your claim. In a money suit, it is a very simple thing to determine. It is exactly the amount of money you have asked for, without including interest. Because interest is not a defined amount. You may have identified interest, so you don't know how much interest you end up getting received. So on your core principal claim, you say, this is my amount, I am claiming 100 rupees. You have a requirement under the Court Fees Act to pay 3% as court fees ad valorem. So you will pay 3 rupees as court fee. Your suit commences, you bring it into evidence that in your money suit that you have 100 rupees to gain. If the same suit were a property suit, you would attach a value to the property. Quite often what happens is, even though the value of the property may be much higher, people will simply come and say, for the purposes of court fee, I'm valuing the property at 2 crores. Why 2 crores? It gives them the right to go into the High Court and get what they would perceive as better adjudication. So they've secured the jurisdiction of the High Court. They've settled the amount at 2 crores and they have paid a court fee on that. However, when they go into trial, now suddenly greed kicks in and they say the actual value of the property is, say, 10 crores. At that point in time, the court has every right to say, has the power to say, and to hold that your particular claim has been undervalued and therefore insufficient court fees has also been paid. So you are required then to amend your claim to show the appropriate value and to make up the deficiency in court fee. You can, of course, take the view that the court is wrong and go in appeal and take your chances in that way. But the short point that I'm trying to make is that the ad valorem declaration of value by the plaintiff is sufficient at the start of a suit to institute the suit. But as and when evidence comes in that that value was fictitious and that in fact a real value is something else, whether by way of admission by the plaintiff or by way of other documentary evidence, then the court has every right, every power to ask you to make up the deficient court fee. Right? So these are the requirements of a valid plaint. I therefore now go to what is the crux, which is the rejection of a plaint, where it does, and the first ground is where it does not disclose a cause of action. You can't be vague about the injury you have suffered. You have to be absolutely clear that somebody came and hit me, for example, and it led to the following injuries, which led to the following medical expenses and has caused me damages in terms of my inability to earn income for that period of time. Value all of that. So your cause of action there becomes the act of being hit by someone, right? And that is a valid cause of action. Supposing you were to institute a suit where you have, where you have placed a cause of action, or on the basis of a cause of action, which is vague, or you are unable to establish it other than by through any sort of documentation, then what are the consequences? If it is a vague cause of action, if it is an unclear cause of action, if you are unable, for example, to assert clearly whether payment has been made to you or not been made to you, or you are unable to identify who the actual assailant is and who it is not, then you have a vague cause of action and your plaintiff is likely to be rejected altogether. But if you have a cause of action where you are clear about these aspects, but you're not clear about an amount, that is a different matter. The cause of action remains valid. What will be the relief that will eventually be granted will have to be determined based on what is established in the evidence. So merely because you don't know how much to claim does not mean that you do not have a valid cause of action. Vagueness is a different requirement of a cause of action, or the absence of a cause of action is where you are unable to identify either what happened to you or who the person was who committed that act. D is where the relief claimed is undervalued and the plaintiff, in being required by the court to correct the valuation in a time fixed by the court, fails to do so. In the preceding slide, I had explained the concept of ad valorem value, right? So you have now valued it, and based on that, you paid a court fee, and the court now finds during the course of evidence that this is not good enough. You didn't value it correctly. The amount of court fee you're paying is not sufficient, and that they then pass an order asking you to make up that gap. If you refuse to make up that gap, you may go and appeal. You may say that you may take the view that the court is wrong, and you go and appeal and you say, no, I had paid the correct court fee. However, if the appellate court does not stay the suit, the proceedings in the suit pending the adjudication of your appeal, if they do not stay the suit, then the trial court, which is hearing the suit, has every right to reject your plaint on the ground that you are not making up the court fee. So really, this is only a question of valuation and how much court fee has to be paid. Where the relief claimed is properly valued, but the plaint is written upon paper insufficiently stamped. Take B and C together; they go hand in hand. The first part is you have undervalued it, right? Where it should have been 10 crores, you have said 2 crores to the value of the property. And a consequence of that is you have paid too little court fee. That comes into C. So if you go to 10 crores, you'll be paying a different court fee altogether. You'll be paying 30 lakhs, and that 3 lakhs. And that, by the way, is what fits under C. D is where the suit appears in the statement in the plaint to be barred by any law. So you have a cause of action because somebody has harmed you by way of, say, a breach of contract, has not paid your money. You have correctly valued it. You are clear about how much the money claim is, and you've set that out, and you've paid the court fee on it, and there is no deficiency whatsoever. But you could still be stopped by the fact that that cause of action is barred by law. So let's take an example of this. I have a commercial transaction with another corporation. That corporation goes into bankruptcy. After bankruptcy proceedings under the IBC, the bankruptcy code, have been initiated against that company, I institute a suit in a civil court, or even prior, I institute a suit in a civil court, and I say that I am owed so much money by this company. The court will have to take the view that under the bankruptcy code, all suits are barred. That devolution of asset of the allegedly bankrupt company can only occur through the bankruptcy court, through the NCLT and the NCLAT, which are the principal bankruptcy court, and through the resolution professional. This used to also be the case in the old SICA, which is the Sikh Industrial Companies Act, where you had Section 20, which would place a bar on suit, where if you were a Sikh company, your net worth or 50% of your net worth had been wiped out, or your net worth had been entirely wiped out, I forget the standard right now, you would be protected from any suit being instituted against you in a claim. So that is an example of where suits are barred by law, even though you have all of the requirements met, but the law itself comes forward and says you can't file a suit. There are also, as I had pointed out, various tenancy agreements, various other kinds of tenancy legislation, agricultural legislation, private forest legislation, where suits are barred. But what you are allowed to institute instead is a writ petition in case you suffer an injury. So you will have to be clear that when you institute a suit, there is no particular bar under any law. E is a minor procedural requirement where it is not filed in duplicate. Order for Rule 1 requires that, or Rule 1 and 2 require that the plaint be filed in duplicate. If it is not filed in duplicate, it is liable to be rejected or returned. Where the plaintiff is, let's leave Rule 9 out. That is, again, a minor processual requirement which you can handle. Now, other material considerations, I have dealt with jurisdiction in quite a lot of detail already. I would only like to point out that an order passed by a court having no jurisdiction is a nullity. However, if you look at territorial jurisdiction or pecuniary jurisdiction as distinct from subject matter jurisdiction, then the first two, that is territorial jurisdiction as well as pecuniary jurisdiction, must be raised at the first possible instance and in any event no later than the framing of issues. If you do not raise these two requirements, territorial jurisdiction as well as pecuniary jurisdiction, prior to the framing of issues, then the doctrine of waiver kicks in, which means you have waived your right to be heard by another court, and you acquiesce to be heard by this particular court, despite the fact that in law you would have had the option to have the suit dismissed on grounds of lack of territorial jurisdiction or lack of pecuniary jurisdiction. So very simply put, territorial jurisdiction, pecuniary jurisdiction objections you must take at the very latest prior to the framing of issues. Once you have taken the objection, it is very possible the court will frame an issue on your objection, which is fine, no problem at all. There is no requirement that the territorial jurisdiction objection or the pecuniary jurisdiction objection must be determined prior to framing of issues. It can in fact become one of the issues and can be determined at the end by the court after listening to all of the evidence as well. Now, subject matter jurisdiction is of course a different commodity altogether, because that pertains to the court in the estimation of the court system, that particular court's ability to appreciate the issue at hand. And because the law deems that that particular court cannot and is not competent to deal with the issues at hand, the objection to subject matter jurisdiction can be taken at any given time. So let's take an example where you file a suit and you file a oppression mismanagement suit in a civil court. The civil court does not take any objections as to the NCLT. You do not, defendant files no objections to the jurisdiction of the NCLT. The court itself does not observe this, does not notice this. A decree is passed. Appellate court also ignores the fact that the appropriate forum should have been the NCLT and affirms the decree. The second appellate court does the same. In SLP, for the first time, the ground is taken that the civil court had no subject matter jurisdiction on the issue because of the existence of the NCLT. Then the Supreme Court would set aside the decree, even a current decree, twice over concurrent decree, because the court initially lacked subject matter jurisdiction. So subject matter jurisdiction is extremely important. It can hurt you very badly if you get it wrong. And so therefore that is something you must focus on. Now we come to the concept of joinder. Material considerations 2 and 3 will deal with joinder. In 2, we will deal with joinder of parties. In 3, we will deal with joinder of causes of action. Joinder of parties, you can have non-joinder and misjoinder. Non-joinder, as the term implies that a party that you should have made a party to the suit, a person that you should have made party to the suit has not been made a party by you. Or misjoinder, which is that a person who ought not to be made party, against whom relief cannot be claimed, has been made party, even though they are materially innocent. Firstly, there are two kinds of parties for the purposes of this rule. There is a necessary party and a proper party. Necessary party is one in whose absence no effective decree can be passed. This is generally going to be a principal defendant, the person who is going to pay you, the person who has caused you injury, the person against whom you have a cause of action. A proper party is one whose presence is necessary for complete adjudication of the dispute. They are persons who have knowledge of the particular suit or the facts of the case or the facts of the suit and have otherwise been involved to ancillary effect. There is no particular claim against them, but because of the nature of their knowledge and the nature of their actions, they are intrinsically linked to the cause of action and therefore are necessary. So let me give you a small example. Let's say you have a tripartite contract, 3 parties to a contract. Party A wishes to sue party C for their inaction. In between, there is party B. This is a contract for sale of goods. A has sold goods to B. B was then to onward sell to and transport to C. B becomes a proper party. C becomes a necessary party because against C you wish to claim, and so they are materially interested and they must pay out. Whereas party B becomes a proper party because they are aware of the facts and circumstances and can verify that supply of goods to C actually took place, and that those goods were the very goods that originated from party A. So they become a proper party and would be made party to the suit and can be made party to the suit. If in that example B is not made party to the suit, B can certainly be brought in as a witness. If you don't make a proper party a party to the suit, there is no consequence visited upon you. If you fail to make a necessary party a party to the suit, then your suit is liable to be dismissed for non-joinder of a proper party. These sound like very harsh provisions, but in actual practical reality, magistrates will first turn to you and tell you, look, you need to make X person a party, or you need to fill up your court fee, or you need to do so and so, and give you time for it. So it is not as if it's a guillotine that suddenly falls on your head. You have enough time to make your determination as to whether you want to fill that gap or take the order in appeal or act as you wish to. Now, what is misjoinder? Misjoinder are where parties are inserted who do not either have a right to sue or against whom no relief can be claimed because they are not materially interested in the subject matter of the suit. So, for example, there is a husband and wife. They both reside in a particular house. The house is owned only in the name of the husband, and some third party is trying to purchase that house or claim ownership of that house. The wife is not a necessary party to such a suit. She may be a proper party only, or maybe a witness, but she's not a necessary party because she's not an owner of the property. So she should not be made a plaintiff. Similarly, the third party who is trying to purchase or present himself as owner, their spouse or their children are not proper parties or necessary parties. So misjoinder is really about inserting parties against whom no relief is claimed and who have no knowledge of the matter and who are not otherwise materially interested. Just to go back to the misjoinder, sometimes what happens is you join parties claiming that they have a particular knowledge of the facts. So in the example I gave, you could also institute against the person who was claiming and their wife, but the wife would then be made into a pro forma party because you're not claiming. So the concept of a pro forma party is that even in misjoinder, when you added someone who you ought not to have added, the court will designate them as a pro forma party, therefore be aware by that designation that no relief is to be given against a particular party. But because you put them in the plaint, they are made into a party. That pro forma party has every right to move an application under Order 1, Rule 10 saying, delete me from the array of parties. I don't fit here. Now, the more complex issue is misjoinder of causes of action. You saw in parties non-joinder and misjoinder of parties. Non-joinder of a cause of action is what you saw in Order 7, Rule 11A, which is a plaint does not state a cause of action. If it does not state a cause of action, there is no suit, that plaint is rejected. So that's a non-joinder of cause of action. Misjoinder is when you mix two unrelated causes of action, quite simply put. Where several causes of action are joined together in the suit, which cannot be joined together since there is no common question of law and fact, and therefore the suit is bad for misjoinder of cause of action. And the example I've given here is a very simple example, and it should clarify things. In a suit for partition by one brother against his remaining siblings, say one brother is filing against 4 other siblings, brothers and sisters, he also seeks a money claim against one of the siblings which arises from a separate independent transaction between them. So brother A files against brother and sisters B, C, D, and E. A also for partition, he claims partition of all the suit properties, but in that also he says, well, E also owes me X amount of rupees and I'm adding that in. That cannot be done. That is a separate cause of action. Why can it not be done? Because a particular court is to examine issues relating to evidence of a particular cause of action. On the partition side, they will have certain issues, certain witnesses, and certain evidence that they will have to appreciate. When you add on this independent money claim, you are asking them to do a de novo exercise, a second exercise to evaluate evidence on that cause of action, which has no overlap with all of the evidence that they've already heard. So you're effectively asking them to hear two suits. So the law makes it easier and says, instead of making this feasible just because the parties are common, we are going to say, please file a separate suit, because the focus of the court should be on one area and not two areas at the same time. So we split up causes of action. We say, focus on one thing at a time. This particular cause of action, in this court, second cause of action, file a separate suit, another court. The final material consideration is res judicata and constructive res judicata. Quite simply, filing of a second suit against the same person in relation to the same cause of action is barred by law. Please be careful that the person should be the same and the cause of action should be the same. One of the tricky things with res judicata that people often forget is that the withdrawal of a suit without any leave to reinstitute in the future amounts to a dismissal for the purposes of a res judicata. So let's say you have instituted a suit against, again, let's take a partition suit again. A has instituted against B to E, but during the course of the suit, B to E come to A and say, look, we're not going to oppose what you want with the property, we'll cooperate with you as you require. Instead of filing a compromise decree, for a compromise decree and an application showing everybody's assent, B to E do not file any written statement. A simply withdraws his suit because he now feels no threat from B to E. In the future, if B to E act against the interest of A in relation to that property, A cannot institute a fresh suit against them because he would be barred by res judicata. So this is something to be careful of. Simply put, withdrawal of a suit has its consequences. It amounts to a dismissal for the purposes of res judicata. Constructive res judicata is filing a suit on a cause of action which could have and ought to have been taken up in a prior suit between the same parties, and this is barred by order 2, rule 2. Let's take the example. Let's go back to our specific performance example. In specific performance suits, you can claim the performance of the contract and in the alternative that your money be paid back with interest. If you choose not to take that second cause of action, which is the money to be paid back to you along with interest, you pursue only the specific relief cause of action, which is that the contract must be executed, and you fail, and that suit becomes final. You cannot thereafter institute a second suit against the same party saying, well, now that my cause of action, at least give me my money back. You ought to have done that in the first suit itself. This is the doctrine of finality. If we don't follow these rules of finality, people will keep suing each other repetitively in different rounds. And so as to avoid that, rules of res judicata and constructive res judicata arise. With that, my presentation per se is done. And what I will do is now take up certain questions that were posed to me in the course of the presentation and state a detailed answer as to those. One of the first question I've got is, if notice is not mandatory, then why is it to be sent? Any advantage during trial of having sent a notice? First and foremost, you're right, it is not mandatory. Not being mandatory means that it is not a basis on which your proceeding can be dismissed or allowed. Mandatory does not speak to tactical benefit. Tactical benefit is a different matter. Why do people bother with issuing a notice in the first instance? Firstly, because it can avoid a suit on various occasions. First thing it does, the issuance of a notice, is it focuses your own case. You have the advantage of initiating the litigation as long as you stay within the limitation period. So a client comes to you on day 1 and there are still 500 days of limitation left. You can sit with the client and assess evidence and ask them to bring in more and more evidence. and to make you aware of that evidence so that you can assess and evaluate what the strengths of your case are. And you can take as much time as you want over this and then issue a notice. So the process by which notices are drafted is a very good process by which the client and the lawyer get together and assess the strengths and weaknesses of the case. It's a genuine advantage to a plaintiff, but only to a plaintiff, because the defendant doesn't get this kind of time. But why should a plaintiff get that time? Because the plaintiff is the one who's been injured and has a claim and a cause of action. So you get more benefit under the law in that sense. A notice also gives you the opportunity to explore a settlement. You will issue a notice, you will state in that the various causes of action. You may also tactically decide to present some of your evidence which you feel is quite determinative of the case. The other side then becomes aware of what your demands are. They also become aware of the quality of your evidence, and they may choose that there's no point fighting this in court, let us settle this. And so it can give you an opportunity to explore a settlement. If they are combative and they reply to your notice, and they give you a reply, then at least the notice has served the purpose of being an exploratory exercise, and you are able to now determine at least some of the defenses that are going to come against you, and if there is going to be another attack from their side in the form of a set-off or a counterclaim. So it's a good exercise to suss out both parties. But like I said, there are certain circumstances in which notice is in fact mandatory. So you will have to follow that. Section 138, government companies in case of certain tenancy legislation. And let's understand something that, like I had said earlier, when you institute a suit, notice is anyway immediately issued by the court to the defendants. From the time they receive a copy of the plaint and the documents, the defendant has 30 days to file a written statement. For showing extraordinary cause, that can be extended to 90 days. So no real prejudice is caused to a defendant in our legal system by the non-issuance of a notice. And that is why notice is not a mandatory requirement, because from the time they receive a plaint, they get a specific set of pleadings beyond which the plaintiff cannot travel. So let's be very clear about this. Your cause of action statement becomes so important. If you omit a particular cause of action, you cannot make up for that omission by filing more evidence. Evidence will follow pleading, pleading will not follow evidence. So if you have not pleaded a particular thing, you cannot lead evidence in relation to it. Even if you lead evidence in relation to it, a court will ignore that evidence altogether, right? Now, the second question that came to me is, if a defendant does not receive notice sent by all possible ways, then when does section 80 subclause 2 come into play? Now, section 80 subclause 2 pertains to government company. A question a little confusing, but this is what I received. So I will deal with the law on 80 subclause 2. And there is a judgment called State of Andhra Pradesh versus Pioneer Builders, which is civil appeal number 6114 of 1999, which is a very, very important judgment when it comes to section 80 subclause 2. You will find this is a judgment written by Justice H.K. Seema, and it lays out various principles, pointing out that under the old act, under the pre-amended section 80, there was only section 80 and no other subclauses, and therefore the issuance of notice was mandatory to the government. Under section 80 subclause 2, what now arises is that there are certain cases in which the suit requires immediate interim relief, and that if notice were issued under 80 subclause 1 and the 60-day time period were complied with under 80 subclause 1, then the suit would be infructuous. Small example, I am filing a suit against, there is no statutory remedy, assume, against a demolition order that has been passed against my building. I could go and writ, but I also file a civil suit against, instead of writ, I file a civil suit against the public officer concerned, saying that they have acted out of malice in connivance with my opponents, and therefore have issued this demolition order. The demolition is stated to take place, is scheduled for 5 days after the institution of the suit, or the institution of the application under 80 subclause 2, such that it becomes clear to the court that if you are forced to comply with section 80 subclause 1, that is issuing notice to that particular collector and then waiting for 60 days, then the suit will become infructuous because your property would have stood demolished. And so therefore, the court will say that the requirements of Section 80 subclause 1 are dispensed with on account of the urgency and on account of the nature of the relief claimed. And you are therefore permitted to institute your suit and to obtain relief accordingly. You cannot get interim relief until government appears in court. So on the prior to the date of demolition, in our example, government will be asked to appear in court, and on that day relief can be granted. The third question I've got is on valuation. How do you value a suit? What is ad valorem court fee, and when is it needed to be paid? Actually, very interesting. It's a simple enough question. Ad valorem means at value, and the value is the one that you have attributed, like the example I gave you of taking 2 crores as the net value of a particular property. Although the actual value of the property is 11 crores or more, you pay court fee on 2 crores. The defendant takes an objection that no, the actual market value is 11 crores because the circle rate is 11 crores. The circle rate is a rate determined by the appropriate authority as being an estimate of the market value of a land in a particular area, or a plot of land in a particular area. And it has various legal consequences. It is the rate, for example, at which stamp duty is paid for registration, etc. So you have a judgment of the Supreme Court from 2020 called Agra Diocesan Trust Association versus Anil David and others, which is civil appeal number 1722 of 2020, where specifically this issue is dealt with as to what is ad valorem value, how is it determined, and what do we do in the case of a plaintiff who is suing for land but is misstating the value of that plot of land. So I would implore you to read that judgment. Sum and substance of what emerges from it is that the plaintiff is free to institute the suit on a valuation of his choosing, and that they are not bound to choose a valuation which is the same as the circle rate. However, the issue becomes an issue of evidence, and if in evidence it is determined that the value of the land was actually higher, then the court is free to pass an order saying that the suit has been undervalued and that consequently insufficient court fees paid, directing therefore the plaintiff to amend the suit to show the appropriate valuation and to make up the deficiency in court fee. If you fail to do so, then your suit is liable to be rejected and dismissed. So this is another judgment that I think you should read for the purposes of this particular question. Again, just to repeat, it is Agra Diocesan Trust Association versus Anil David and others, civil appeal number 1722 of 2020. Now, the next question I have is, how can we show that this court has jurisdiction in particular case law while filing a plaint? Jurisdiction, like I said, is a tripartite concept. Territorial jurisdiction you have to show based on where the cause of action arose. You have otherwise various sections of the CPC that point out you can institute a suit where the defendant resides. So you have to only show that the defendant resides within the territorial jurisdiction of the court, or that the cause of action of the contract, for example, is executed in a particular place which is within the court's jurisdiction, or that contract was performed there, that is, payments were made there, or goods were supplied from there, or the goods were received over there, or the goods were supposed to be used over there, so on and so forth. That's territorial jurisdiction. As to pecuniary jurisdiction, you will convince the court by showing the valuation of your suit, showing the valuation of your property. This goes back to the ad valorem issue. If you frame the valuation incorrectly, and in the course of evidence it emerges that the value is actually much higher, the court can return your plaint and say, go back to the higher court because your value is more than what you had. Then is the pecuniary jurisdiction of the court which is hearing the suit. And the third is subject matter competence. Subject matter competence will depend on the statute under which you file, and you will convince the court that the facts of your case fit within that statute, or that there is no other bar of subject matter competence on that particular court. If a plaint is liable to be rejected on the grounds of being time barred, can one still subsequently go to a high court through Article 226? Actually, very interesting question. And there is a specific Supreme Court judgment on the issue, which is Mahabir Kishore versus State of Madhya Pradesh. reported at AIR 1990 Supreme Court 313. Let's first understand that a writ and a suit have different purposes, correct? A writ is for very specific administrative law grounds against a state authority only, not against a private party. You can institute a suit also against government institution, against government party, that we've seen as is envisaged under Section 80 of the CPC. If your suit is barred by limitation, then let's be clear, a writ can be filed also on that cause of action, but a writ is for limited grounds, for limited remedies, firstly. Secondly, while the limitation does not apply to a writ, the concept of delay and laches does apply to writ jurisprudence. So proceedings under Article 226 are not subject to the Limitation Act. But the courts have designed rules of laches and delay which say if you waited too long, say you waited 10 years, 15 years before you decided to file the writ, the court will say, sorry, we're not going to interfere with someone who sits on their rights in this manner. So that's a short answer. You can file the writ. The other way to look at this question, because there wasn't clear clarity, is that if my plaint is rejected for violation of the law of limitation, can I file a writ against that order? And the short answer is no, you cannot, because an order of rejection of the plaint under Order 7, Rule 1 is an appealable order. Therefore, there is an efficacious, equally efficacious alternative statutory remedy, which is the filing of an appeal. Therefore, you are not permitted to file a writ. The last question that I have received is, if a contract has an arbitration clause, but the parties choose to not make it operational mutually and directly go to the court, will a jurisdiction issue arise? That is, will the court say that it does not have jurisdiction as per now, as there exists in the arbitration clause? The parties, an arbitration clause is an independent contract, and like all contracts, it is dependent on consensus ad idem. Parties can breach that consensus ad idem. You don't even need, the way this can easily be done, let me give you a simple example, is I have a contract in which there is an arbitration clause, but I choose to institute a suit in the appropriate form, in the appropriate court, the competent court. My defendant comes to court and chooses not to take the benefit of Section 9 of the Arbitration Act, and says instead that we would like to be adjudicated here. The court has every power to say that both parties have chosen to waive the cause of action, waive the arbitration clause, and therefore they can be heard in a suit. But please be clear that the waiver of an arbitration clause requires the consent of both parties. It cannot be done in the instance of only one party. If one party has instituted the suit, but the other party moves an application under Section 9 of the Arbitration Act, the court is bound to dismiss the suit and direct the plaintiff to approach the appropriate arbitral forum. I think with that, we've covered all the questions and all the material. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you again.